So in this video, we're going to talk a bit about the executive director. Now, let me just reemphasize again the difference between governance and operations. Okay. So in a school setting, which, this is true in any organization, but I'll tell you what it looks like in a school setting. Your operations is going to be, teaching, curriculum planning, event planning. It's also going to include things like building your website, keep budgeting, all of the administrative tasks that go in behind the actual program stuff. And nonprofit language is like administrative and program. Program is like the missional stuff, and administrative is like the stuff that has to happen behind the scenes to make sure the programming happens. And that actually comes to be important in bookkeeping and stuff like that. But that is the operational, day-to-day stuff that has to happen. Okay. So in a school setting, that's usually performed by employees. Employees are hired to, maybe update the website, build a website. It could also be like a contractor to keep the books, to teach the kids, to plan the curriculum. All that is done by the operational staff. Okay. Now the operational staff could also be volunteer staff, but it's still operational. Okay. Now the board is doing all the governance stuff that we already talked about. They're overseeing the compliance and the finances and the strategic planning. Where they bridge themselves into operations is by making sure that there's an executive director or possibly an executive staff who are overseeing operations. So they're choosing somebody who is qualified to do this, who understands the mission of the organization, and who also knows how to make the operations happen. Okay. So really quick, I'm just going to show you this document that I created just for our program at one point, to reflect our program, I guess I should say. And it might help you just see this executive staff. So this is your board. This is you guys. Okay. If it were an LLC, it would be an owner. And again, depending on how big you are, this could be this entire thing could be one person. If it's a micro school with a few students, then the board appoints the executive director, and they do all the programming and all the administration, which might actually mean they literally do accounting and infrastructure, website stuff, and admissions for new families, and are the teacher or in the curriculum. That could all be one person in a small organization. As it gets bigger and more complex, you can see that the tasks remain the same. You're just going to need more people to perform them. Okay. So the board appoints the executive director. Now, usually it's an executive director. It's one person. The reason I have executive staff on here is because if you have a small team, you probably don't want more than 2, maybe 3 people. If they're co-founders and they're complementary and they really work together and they are very missional and they're both putting in just as much time and effort and kind of completing each other, it might be better to just have co-directors who are both answering to the board. If that happens, you have to be very careful that they understand where their areas of authority are, what they can take care of, just to make sure that there isn't confusion about roles or conflict where they aren't sure if they're allowed to make decisions without talking to the other person or whatever. You want to write job descriptions for each of those people. Anyway, that's a little side note if you have more than one person. If you just have one person, again, this is the only position that answers to the board, okay? So you need to hire this person. You need to have a job description for this person. You need to have roles and responsibilities for this person. You need to hold them accountable. You need to set their salary. That's what the board is doing. Everybody under them, operational, you are trusting the executive director to take care of those positions, okay? So that might mean that this executive director, hires teachers. They might hire a curriculum director. They might do some of those things themselves and hire helpers for some of the other parts, right? It's not this hierarchical, organized always. But this is how it would look as far as roles and responsibilities, and that this would be the programming stuff. there's usually a lot of like support stuff as far as like logistical things, might be building in classroom setup and communication. It might be communication to the families, newsletters, stuff like that. Might be secretarial stuff as far as like getting things printed, might be event planning, field trip planning. Okay, that can be a pretty major job. And if you have like, one person who's trying to do all of those things, it's going to be very time consuming. So they need to be able to have the authority to outsource some of this if they feel the need to do. So then you have your administrative side, which is, again, this is nonprofit language programming, and then like administrative stuff. And this is going to be like your infrastructure, maintaining a website or contracting that out, like infrastructure systems like forms and, maybe you sign up for Jotform or DocuSign or something like that. Overseeing those systems, signups, things like that. Human resources, if you have any employees, you're going to need payroll. You're going to have like, have payroll where you actually pay the people. There's also like onboarding, like getting them on board, making sure all the paperwork and the tax forms and all that stuff are in. Any kind of compliance as far as human resources. Now, the next two things you're going to see are compliance and finance. Those sound familiar because you're a board, and we already talked about compliance and finance. Those are your jobs, right? Okay, just to clarify, those are your jobs legally to make sure that they're getting done and it's getting done well. Okay, so if you're in a small organization and you're willing to put in the time, you might actually have a board member who fills out the tax form, okay, fills out the state forms, actually does the work and research to create the annual budget, who actually monitors and sets up the money flow systems. However, in anything but a pretty small organization, that's ends up becoming a pretty time-consuming job. So if you're a medium or larger size, you're probably going to have at least some staff who are helping with this. So if you have like maybe an administrative director or a financial director and overseeing this, their job is going to be like, like making sure they're talking to the program people, the teachers, any program like supervisors. If you have multiple teachers and you have a supervisor overseeing them, like as far as their needs for supplies, curriculum, like there's a lot of research that goes into creating an annual budget. They need to understand what's happening with the programming. That person is going to be talking to these people, is probably going to be planning meetings. They're going to be all of that kind of stuff. It's like work that has to go into creating an annual budget, which is something you will be approving as a board. Okay. But that doesn't mean you necessarily have to build the whole thing from the ground up, because you really need to know what's going on the ground in order to build money flow systems, making sure that the money is going in, that the fees are being paid, that it's all being book kept the correct way. Nonprofit bookkeeping is a whole thing. They have to use the right language. So just either actually doing the bookkeeping, making sure the systems are set up correctly, or outsourcing that to a bookkeeper to understand the nonprofit language. All of that stuff, you need to make sure that it is getting done by someone who understands how to do it, okay? So let me back up and make sure I didn't just confuse you on that, because the board is responsible legally for these things, yes. But they are only responsible for the executive director as far as the operations, okay? So that's why it's very important that you choose an executive director who is held accountable to make sure that not just this stuff is happening, but this stuff is happening, okay? In that they understand managing the entire budget, because this executive director is going to be making decisions on salaries for everybody. The board should be deciding their salary, which means you're going to have to understand the entire organization budget enough to set their salary, right? But the executive director is actually going to be writing job descriptions, roles and responsibilities, holding accountable performance evaluations, and salaries and all of that stuff. The executive director will be doing that for all of the staff under them. You will, as a board, will only be doing that for the executive director, okay? But it's important that that executive director knows the entire budget so that they can set the salaries for everybody. They know when to hire someone, when not to hire somebody, when to get, have people wear a couple hats, when to hire a new person. It's kind of like a resource allocation thing that they need to do as far as the administration, but also the programming as far as like how many hours a teacher needs to work, when to hire a need, when not to hire a need, whether they should be part-time, full-time, whatever. Okay. So that executive director is a pretty big picture skill set that they need to be able to see the entire organization operationally and monitor all of it. Okay. So as a board, you need to make sure that person is able to do all of that and that they're able to delegate when they need to delegate, and that they can oversee this. So for the board to oversee compliance finance, just to clarify that again, as a board, one channel through which they're doing that is making sure the executive director knows that that's part of their job, and then holding them accountable to make sure that it's getting done, right? But that's also going to happen on an ongoing basis when the executive director brings a tax form that needs to be signed to a meeting that always happens at a certain time of year, because that's when the taxes are due. And the board knows that's happening, and they're making sure that happens. And if it doesn't happen, they miss it. They say, wait, we're supposed to be reviewing the tax form. The 990 needs to be signed and sent in by November. And, where's the tax form? We have to do this in September, October. That's the accountability part that the board is absolutely responsible for. If the taxes don't get in, that's on the board ultimately, okay? But it's through the executive director, who should be either doing it themselves or outsourcing it or being on top of the accounting firm and making sure they're doing it, or whatever it is to do to make sure that that's happening, okay? They're also making sure that the teachers are delivering the mission, the staff is delivering the mission on the program end of it. So the executive director often can end up being the founder because they're doing a ton of work as far as the day-to-day operational stuff, and very few people can work 20, 30, 40 hours a week without any pay. So the executive director often ends up being the founder, but the board needs to formally have a meeting where they appoint the executive director. They say, they need to take the time to say, here's what an executive director needs to be able to do. Oversee operations, they're going to be working this many hours. This is how much we're going to be paying them. Here's how we're going to hold them accountable. Here's how we're going to evaluate them. That should all be written in a contract that the board is responsible for. And it should be formalized. It should be written down. It should be formalized. They should be appointed. They should understand their areas of authority. They should be able to go out and do their job and do it well and know that you trust them, okay? Them, her, him. Or again, if it's maybe you have two co-founders, one of them is really good at administrative stuff, the other one's really good at program stuff, maybe you can appoint both of them and have each of them, write their job description, make sure they understand their roles and responsibilities, have them both involved in those conversations so there isn't any miscommunication or misunderstanding. And then you'll be evaluating both of them. That might be just a better way to do it. Does it really matter as long as there's clarity and the board understands who they're overseeing, okay? And then you're going to make sure that you're evaluating that executive person every year. And some ideas for that would be doing a 360 with the staff, having them fill out a form about the executive director, make sure that you're catching any issues that they might be having, any weak areas. If they have a weak area, maybe they don't like confrontation, maybe they're really not very detail-oriented, maybe they aren't a very good team player or whatever. People have their things, right? This isn't a gotcha trying to find a problem with them. That's never good management, but it's just a relational, it should always be relational, but you also want to be proactive. You want to make sure that you have a system in place where you just regularly check in, you allow for feedback, you allow for input from everybody who's working with this person. So you as board members will want to each individually gives input on this person, right? Are they really quiet? Are they strongly opinionated? Things like that you would maybe notice. I'd like to hear them speak up more, or maybe I'd like them to be a better listener or whatever. It's things like that where you're and of course you want to always point out all the positives also, but the board should be giving input, the staff should be giving input, and then the person themselves should do a self-evaluation, okay? So that's one good way to do it. A board member may want to even pop in on the person on campus someday a couple times and just meet with them or walk around the building, right? And be present and see what the environment is like, what the culture is like, catch them. Or do they stand out at recess with the teachers? Do they pop in and out of classrooms? Do they know the kids' names, right? And this is, again, in a school model. And this would be it depends on which of the jobs the executive director is doing, what you're actually looking for as far as their skills, and what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. But you're just being present with the actual operations here and there is a good way to also evaluate. And then, you would sit down with the person probably every year and kind of go through these evaluations, summarize them, look for areas where they can improve, ask them like, this, and if they're like, oh yeah, I really do struggle with that. Like, I wish I could outsource that. I really, really don't want to do this particular thing. I feel like I struggle with it. Well, then as a board member, you like figure out ways that you can support them, ways that you can get them more resources for that. So that is your job as a board, to appoint the executive director. And then they need to understand that they have the authority and the responsibility to make sure all the operations happen. And they need to be able to handle all of the pieces, the administrative and the program pieces. It can be helpful if they are a good delegator and they're a big picture person. Of course, the most important thing is that they understand the mission of the organization, and the delegation and all of that can just kind of depend on how big the program is. So that is one of your major jobs as a board, and it is something that you need to really put a lot of time and effort and thought into, and make sure you're doing it in a formal way as far as contracts, pay, and accountability, so that everything is clear, everything is laid out well, and there is a good system in place should there ever need to be another executive director, and other boards who may not know the executive director that first got appointed or whatever. Remember, some of these systems are there so that they're sustainable in the long run when people change. A nonprofit is bigger than the founder. It's bigger than the board. That's why it's set up like it is. It should be set up so that it is bigger than any one individual, which doesn't mean that the founder or the board, the board member, whoever is really passionate about the project is like somehow disposable or something. That's not at all what we're saying. But if you want the mission, remember this whole thing about a nonprofit is that the mission is like, it's mission critical. Like, that's the big important reason why you exist, is the mission. It's not because of any one particular person. So if that's the most important thing, you want it to be bigger than any one person as far as the sustainability and the systems that are in place, which is going to mean making sure you have strategic plans, making sure you have a good job description for your executive director, make sure you're paying them in a good way so that they're not like just all giving heart and then they burn out and then there's like no money in the budget to pay somebody else or whatever. Like, it's just being like careful for a person, but for a mission, not for a particular founder, but for the organizational structure being sustainable. Okay, that's part of your duty of care as a board. All right, so that's what I want to say about executive director, executive staff, and we will see you next time for more information.